So it seems that with Emperor's Children teased for 2025 specifically, they're going to be the next faction to be added into Warhammer 40k, but what will come after them? In the future it seems that 40k's got a good chance they're in for some tech heresy. Hello and welcome back to Warspecs Tactics, where today I wanted to do a bit more of a speculative one as to Games Workshop's future releases and the likely choices that they have for new factions to be added to the game. In general, Games Workshop really enjoy releasing new armies, expanding their Warhammer 40k offering and delving into further deeper depths of the universe, and it seems to be something they can afford to do more than ever at the moment, with 40k growing as a player base, between 10th edition attracting a lot more interest and Space Marine 2 coming out recently. They'll certainly enjoy coming out with whole new model army ranges, as they're basically new miniatures that no one's had the chance to pick up yet. And while I'm sure lots of people with current armies would much prefer them getting round to some of the armies that really need attention in-game at the moment in terms of miniature releases, that's just not really the way that they tend to work. Tending to do more of a balance between updates for existing factions and new stuff coming out alongside. What's been kind of interesting over the past 10 years or so with Games Workshop's various new armies out there is they do genuinely seem to be ticking off a whole bunch of fan demands in terms of new factions people would like to see. Lots of stuff that had relatively big presence in the lore and people would instead take to kit bashing or converting entire armies to make, kind of showing that there's demand there, and then coming out with plastic armies to try and tap into that kind of demand. In the past they tended to be a bit more monolithic and just literally dictating what came out. I believe there was an infamous interview in the past kind of taking pride in doing no market research, but that really doesn't seem to be the case any longer. In 8th edition and prior we had a bunch of armies realised, like Adeptus Mechanicus themselves, Genestealer Cult and Sisters of Battle redone in plastic, all of which were kind of meme status or long shot requests that people didn't think that they'd do anytime soon. When they tend to expand armies like this, it's almost certainly via cool things that are already in the lore or their own factions in-game that they've established a bit, but then want to go even further down the route of new model releases for them, far more commonly than coming up with something truly new and just crowbarring it into the setting. It just feels a bit less natural that way. Looking back at one of my channel's slightly earlier videos, I did a poll of what should get a full army in 2021, so that's just literally 3 years ago now, and here are the top 10 choices. It is kind of surprising just how many of these you can field in Warhammer 40k, at least in some form or another now. I think you could argue that around about 6 or 6.5 of these might be pretty much ticked off in terms of Games Workshop releases, which in just 3 years is kind of impressive in Games Workshop's terms. Rogue Traders might have always been a curious way to have a 40k faction. They basically can field a themed detachment in their Voidfarers now, even if it's not really much of an army, mainly just 2 units, plus Inquisitorial ally support. Eldar Exodites is one of the ones that they haven't done anything for. Instead they've been focusing on getting the actual Eldari range into plastic, and it sounds like there'll be more progress on that in early 2025. Don't really blame them for not releasing new flavours of Eldar while they haven't updated their craft worlds. Squats were in 8th, and we got the Leagues of Votann in their new form, plus plenty of Necromunda releases for the old style squats too. Black Templars were voted as well, and they got their small range completely refreshed and independent as their standalone codex once again. Legion of the Damned were voted 6th, Fiery Spectral Space Marines that I don't think they'd ever be their own independent army, but maybe could be fun for a kill team or similar style release at some stage. World Eaters got their codex release in 2023, though a few more models would be nice. Crew got perhaps a surprisingly major refresh this year, plus their own detachment, so you can field them independently even if their range isn't really well rounded enough to stand on their own 2 feet without tail support. Renegade Guard might not be able to be fielded as their own codex at the moment, but they have had a bunch of Cultist and Mutant model releases between things like Accursed Cultists, Renegade Guardsmen and Felgor Beastmen. You can put them on the table with a Chaos Cult detachment and have quite good success with them at the moment in tournaments, though technically they're still part of the Chaos Space Marine book, so I'll give them a sort of half mark for that. And then just recently we've had Emperor's Children with a teaser for 2025, so it seems that they're coming soon to round out the Deity Codex Pantheon. As you could probably tell though, the one I wanted to focus on today was the one from that list that was voted in the first place, which is Dark Mechanicum, and I must admit they do feel like one of the conspicuous ones out of that, given that Games Workshop has ticked off, or at least partially ticked off, perhaps the majority of the list, yet one of the ones that is clearly one of the single most popular don't seem to have been touched yet. Obviously we don't have a crystal ball to know what's next in Games Workshop's future, but in terms of armies to be fully realised with a major faction release, I'd say there's at least some pretty good odds that they could be next after Emperor's Children. I guess for potential rivals for that title, they perhaps could do Renegade Guard or Lost of the Damned in their own codex in some form. Maybe scrape together a few of the existing kits from Codex Chaos Marines and bring out a bunch of other ones to round out their army perhaps. Would be quite cool to have a codex for the mortal followers of Chaos. Otherwise, for perhaps slightly more likely ones, could be something based around one of the remaining Primarchs that hasn't been released yet, say Perturabo or Lorgar bringing the Iron Warriors or the Word Bearers into the focus, or perhaps Vulcan as one of the next most likely Loyalist Primarchs to come back at some stage, perhaps after Lehman Russ. I could easily see the major release of a Primarch like that bringing some more releases for their chapter or legion. Otherwise, I guess Harlequins could go back to full faction status again, though I'm not sure they really count as a new army release, seeing as they've already got a range. I can't help but think that Games Workshop will be unlikely to do things like Exodites, Corsairs, or Inari as anything other than an Eldari subtype, given popularity of factions and how many sell. I'm not sure they'd be super keen to try and introduce a new flavour of Space Elves independently, particularly as they did that with Harlequins and then folded them back into the Codex. Or I guess thinking more weird and wonderful, they could maybe try and bring another Xenos race to the fore. Perhaps something like either Hrud or Space Skaven of some kind could be one of the most likely things. That does seem like a bit more of an out there idea though, and maybe didn't have the same amount of focus as things like the Squats did, given that they used to be a faction and then got removed in the early stages of 40k. If we do focus on Dark Mechanicum as a potential release, given that they're a top voted faction that people want to see, their lore is interesting enough, the twisted dark mirror of the Adeptus Mechanicus, basically as the Chaos Space Marines are to regular Space Marines, or the Chaos Knights are to the Imperial Knights. For the Great Schism within the Machine Cult though, they see themselves as the proper ones, often referring to themselves as the New Mechanicum or the True Mechanicum. As with the rest of the Emperor's forces during the Great Crusade, a huge chunk of the Mechanicum fell in favour of the War Master during the Horus Heresy, including a massive civil war on Mars itself, that the traitors basically gained the upper hand on. After the Siege of Terror, the traitors were hounded back to the Eye of Terror, and plenty of Dark Mechanicum forces followed them, maintaining great hell forges that churn out weapons and material to supply the traitor legions, and the various other forces of chaos safe from the Emperor's wrath. Compared with their dogmatic Agmech brothers, the Dark Mechanicum tend to be far more creative and less dogmatic, openly embracing crafting disturbing new technologies between technology, demon weapons, Xenos technology, and abominable intelligences, as opposed to the Agmech generally tending to prefer to further understand mysteries and relic tech of the past from the dark age of technology. In general, as a non-playable faction, there's really not been that much focus on their lore in the more modern 40k setting, more tending to come up on the fringes as passing or some key characters, but not really taking the centre stage as an antagonist force, perhaps partly due to Games Workshop not wanting to delve too deep into the type of units that they have before they decide to make them. For one of the only 40k miniatures that we've had for Dark Mechanicum, they did see a bit of fun representation in Blackstone Fortress with the Negavolt Cultists, and it was kind of interesting that some other bits from that game made their way into more mainstream 40k. The Traitor Guardsmen and the Chaos Beastmen both got full unit releases in Kill Team, and they got incorporated into the Chaos Space Marine Codex. These Negavolt Cultists, I think, had quite fun and suitably disturbing messed up miniatures. A whole load of mecha tendrils coming out of this guy's head here, and an all very sinister fusion of man and machine beyond that. Apparently the aim of these guys is that they'll often form cults on Imperial worlds, trying to corrupt the holy technology of the Admech with a good dose of demon possession in some way, shape or form. And they have mysterious technology that powers up and draws force from their own pain and hatred somehow, unleashing it out in bolts of warp-fused energy to blast through enemy infantry formations. In their own weird way, they sort of feel like their dark counterpart of the Mechanicus Electro Priests maybe, or very infused with emotive force and blasting enemies apart with it. Seems like if we ever did see a Dark Mechanicum faction for 40k, some version of these guys would likely be an elite infantry. Games Workshop have brought Dark Mechanicum to the fore a little bit more recently in their latest reveal show as well, showcasing some Dark Mechanicum technology and artwork for their Heresy Era setting. The models that they revealed were ones for Legions Imperialis, so basically 30k Heresy things but on super small scale, but they did note that this would be the first time that you'd probably be able to play as a Dark Mechanicum force in any of their settings, and does seem at least some chance they might get representation in main scale Heresy and 40k. The main miniatures they revealed for these were a bunch of Stalker Walkers. These ones are the Cerberos Overlord Heavy Stalkers with some big firepower. Apparently the one on the left is an ether-powered exoplanar bombard, the one on the right having a storm laser array, and then backed up by either las cutters or radiation engines to lay waste to enemy infantry. They followed up that preview with another Heresy Thursday one. These ones I believe are slightly smaller ones called Battle Stalkers, an Archer Ranged one and an Erax Butcher one, that one having a disturbing mesh of all sorts of claws, saws and drills to get to work on the enemy with. They also had some more minor things called Harpack Swarmer Scout Hosts. These ones feel maybe not so very different away from things like Necron Wraiths perhaps, hovering robot automata drones armed with ranged weapons and considerably smaller than the bigger Stalker pattern things. Given that the Legions Imperialis things have often been releasing kind of in lockstep with the bigger Heresy era things, it seems at least a reasonable chance that these will come out for full-scale Heresy at some point in the future. And it seems that both in Legions Imperialis and in Heresy there'd be a good chance they can use a bunch of the more mainline staples of the Mechanicum, things like all their fancy battle automata of varying shapes and sizes. As a result, I guess that we'd see Dark Mechanicum first in Heresy before 40k, though who really knows for sure given Games Workshop's release schedules. We already do have a couple of Heresy Era miniatures for Dark Mechanicum too, a couple of Fallen Archmagos special characters, again maybe giving it a little bit of an insight as to the themes that they might go down. Anarchist Scoria on the left here, as a fallen tech priest, seems to have turned himself into a big scuttling scorpion of a creation, and it'd be pretty awesome to see character miniatures like this in full-scale plastic. Since the end of 9th edition, I think people have been a little bit more expectant and wondering whether they might do a Dark Mechanicum release for 40k at some stage, particularly as they had really quite a big campaign series called the Arcs of Omen, with Vashtorr the Archifane at the centre of it, and a plotline that just wasn't really resolved. It did feel like Vashtorr kind of filled a gap within the Chaos deities, the Chaos demigod of the Forge, and it just felt like it made sense to have someone presiding over all the flavours of tech heresy chaos that maybe don't align themselves hugely to any one of the big four. I feel like often on the tabletop and in the lore you don't really get the impression that literally every single, say, Obliterator or Demon Engine is infused with one of the powers of the Dark Gods, whether it's Nurgle, Tzeentch or Slanesh or whatever. Some of them certainly are, but some of them feel a bit more Chaos Undivided and tech heresy for its own sake, and kind of nice to have them to have a bit more of a central figure perhaps. They basically left off the Arcs of Omen campaign with Vashtorr and Abaddon essentially having won, forging the old Dark Angel's homeworld into a great big Demon Forge world webway tunneling device, and setting off to find some sort of great weapon with which Abaddon thinks he can win the war against the Imperium. The last lore update that we had were that Vashtorr seems to have re-emerged in the Pariah Nexus to have a good fight against the Necrons and Abmech, and it was interesting that Dark Mechanicum Covens were specifically mentioned to be amongst his forces. As mentioned before, they often don't really tend to take that sort of centre stage in 40k. My hope is that the massive setup they did with Arcs of Omen will actually lead to some sort of genuinely interesting big lore change that could shake things up to some extent. And I feel like if Games Workshop wants the whole narrative to actually have a big feeling on the tabletop, pairing it with a new and disturbing range of models could be one of the best ways to do so. It kind of remains to be seen what sort of super weapon they decide to unleash upon the Imperium, but I feel like perhaps the most exciting answer to that mystery wouldn't be just some sort of big doomsday device, but maybe having the return of Men of Iron or something like that, or some sort of different Chaos Android style army, and having them bolster Chaos forces and paired with a Dark Mechanicum release. That could be a seriously fun answer to the lore question, as well as time with actual model releases on the tabletop, or just a bit wishlisty and speculation at this point of course. For the sorts of model representation Dark Mechanicum could get, I feel like quite a few of the current 40k things already fit their aesthetic quite well, though I'd guess that Games Workshop would largely leave those to their individual codexes. The Chaos Knights have fit with them really well, but I guess you'd probably have them as allied Dreadblades in the same sort of way as the Imperium uses Imperial Knights. Demon engines like the Venom Crawler or the tech-fused Horrors that are Obliterators would also be right down their lines, but again are both more clearly associated with Chaos Space Marines as opposed to Dark Mechanicum more generally. It feels like if you had a standalone Dark Mechanicum faction, maybe Vashtorr himself would be the only obvious thing that would definitely be in that. He does maybe feel a little bit unusual tacked on to more general Codex Chaos Space Marines when he kind of stands apart from them a bit. With model possibilities and lore that means that they're unusually creative and go wild, I feel like GW could dream up any sort of mad things, and to be fair they did have all sorts of weird tech on the tabletop for the Abmech themselves, everything from D-Day landing hovercrafts to Da Vinci flyers and mechanical dog horse riders. I guess for the Dark Mechanicum the most obvious ones would be Heretic Tech Priests, Negavolt Cultists as a proper unit, definitely some manner of larger demon engines of some sort, something akin to those Stalkers that seem to be the way in Heresy. And then certainly some sort of Chaos Robots, either Men of Iron or Corrupted Automata or Chaos Androids, something to fill that kind of gap. I guess you could just simply go down the more boring route of having a whole bunch of Abmech things but made Chaos, though in general I feel like Games Workshop tends to try and avoid that as much as possible these days. Certainly in 40k they seem to be trying to make the Space Marine line and the Chaos Space Marine line seem to overlap as little as possible, a good bunch of shared options being phased out in one way or another. In any case though, I feel like there's a bunch of pretty tantalising possibilities for them at some time down the line. I guess any sort of launch for them would be kind of unlikely within 10th edition, though certainly not impossible. We did pretty much have 2 new factions in Leagues of Votann and World Eaters in the previous edition, and we've had Death Guard Custodies, Chaos Knights and a bunch of others in recent years as well. I feel like we'd be more odds on to see something, perhaps in 11th maybe, unless Games Workshop really does double down and give them a release towards the end of the year as part of their whole Year of Chaos thing. Let me know your thoughts though. I'd certainly be interested to hear whether or not you'd be interested in collecting an army of Dark Mechanicum, or otherwise, if they decided to do them in some form, what way would you like them to make an army? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new videos just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description down below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.